Let me tell you of a sailor, Harry Bridges is his name. An honest Union leader that the bosses tried to frame. He left home in Australia to sail the seas around. Sailed across the ocean, come to Frisco town. There was only a company union and then the bosses had their way. Us workers had to stand in line for a lousy buck a day. When up spoke Harry Bridges, said us workers must get wise. Our wives and kids will starve to death if we don't get organized. Oh, the FBI is worried and the bosses, they are scared. They can't deport 6 million men, they know.
Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome back to another exciting virtual tour through history, mystery, space, and time. I'm your guide this evening, Chris. And tonight's virtual experience with the Foss Waterway Seaport is brought to you through the generous contributions of both Columbia Bank as well as Port of Tacoma, which is fitting tonight because really they are a central figure in tonight's story, which is, of course, about Harry Bridges. Thanks to Mr. Arlo Guthrie there. I think you got a little sample of what's about to come. But Harry Bridges is this, in my opinion, American folk hero who was born in 1901 in Australia, just outside of Melbourne, finds himself here in the United States, and then transforms the way that labor and unions work within the United States in such a way that they are irrevocably changed. They are something entirely different than that they were when he arrived here. And we get to explore that story tonight. I don't know if you are familiar with Harry Bridges, his life or legacy, but he was truly larger than life in so many ways. And I'm excited to get to share some of that with you guys. So thanks for tuning in. It's good to see you guys. Checking in on comments, because of course we are broadcasting live. So if you have anything to say along the way, please do, and then I'll put it up on the screen so that people who watch later have an opportunity to interact with it. But let's jump on in and tell you a little bit something about Mr. Harry Bridges. And for context on Harry, I think it's important to get a sense for where he came from. Because like I said, he was born in 1901 in Melbourne, Australia, and he was born to a father who was in real estate, and not the way that you might think of it right now. But he essentially ran properties, and one of Harry Bridges' jobs growing up was to collect rents from low-income tenants, where it was really squeezing them to do it. And a couple things worth noting at that point is that he was born Alfred Renton Bryant Bridges and grew up in the suburbs of Melbourne and then changed his name. He ends up changing his name to Harry Bridges, and Harry is the name of his most favorite uncle, who, aside from being an adventurer, a sailor, and pearl diver, was an active socialist in this strike culture of early Australia. And Australia in the 1900s was having this tremendous amount of stress placed on it as a country, because everybody there, for the most part, I think it was something like 74% of the population was laboring to create resources. They were, miners, lumberjacks, pearl divers, whatever, and that they would harvest these resources from the continent of Australia and then ship them to the United Kingdom, of which they were a colony, right? And then the UK would process them and then sell these processed products back to Australia, and left them in eternal poverty. And so there was a tremendous amount of strikes that were going on in the early 1900s in Australia. And young Harry Bridges watched his uncle and really came of age in this culture. And when Harry's dad was like, hey, you are going to work for the family business and collect rents from these tenants, he was like, no, I'm not. I'm going to be a sailor, just like my heroes, my uncle and Jack London. And so Harry takes to sea in a very swashbuckling romantic move. He joins a series of tall ships, sets sail from Australia, and grows up basically like 16 to 21, pretty much as a freelance sailor traveling the world. And as he's going all over the globe, he really starts to cement a lot of these working life philosophies that he takes pretty much through his entire life. In fact, I would argue absolutely through his entire life. And one of the ones that sticks out the most to me is that after going all through the Pacific Rim, he's up and down Southeast Asia, all along South and North America. He ends up going around the world a couple times. He eventually finds himself in San Francisco working as a sailor. And it's in San Francisco that he determines that more than any other place he's ever been, the United States has the worst labor conditions of anywhere in the world that he's experienced. And it galvanizes him into taking action. So while he's in San Francisco in the 1920s and 1930s, he's regularly subjected to one of the worst things he knows of and speaks about regularly, and it's called the shape up. And what used to be the way that you would get work is that if you were a longshoreman, like the gentleman pictured here, to get employment for the day, you would go down to the docks and there would be a foreman or someone who represented the ship or the employer, and they would go out and just pick who they wanted, and you got work for the day. And it was incredibly biased. Not only could you bribe these foremen who are actually selecting people, but they were entirely preferential, and you had to have a clean book. So they kept this book on you, and if you were ever at any point in your work down there, even whispers of being pro-union, you got this mark on your book, and they're like, you're out. You don't get to work for the shipping company anymore. And so the employer had complete control over not only who got to work for the day, but they could dictate the terms exclusively. Any level of work for any amount of money was on the board because there was nobody to tell them no. If at any point you stepped out of line or you wanted more money or you said the work was too dangerous or the hours were too long, you were out, and they could go walk right out the front door to this throng of people waiting to feed their families, pick anyone that they wanted, and just fill that gap for it. And because all you were was just like muscle moving one thing from one place to another, and there was an unlimited supply of people, especially during the 1930s. The Great Depression just put gasoline on this problem and accelerated it to its utmost fever pitch, right? And so as all these people are trying desperately to just survive, they are now confronted with the extra hellish landscape of being at the mercy of these employers who are trying to squeeze every ounce of profit out of it that they possibly can. Enter Harry Bridges. So I want to give you some context on both sides. So this is from a political ad that was running at the time and shows Uncle Sam spanking labor unions represented as hobo clowns here and just getting everybody back in line. Stop acting like a child, right? So this is from the coal strike of November 1919. It gives you a good idea of kind of the attitude towards labor unions at that time. And so when Harry Bridges shows up and starts preaching these ideas that the group is stronger together, right? This is basically Harry Bridges in a nutshell. Throughout his entire career, without error, he says that the group is stronger together, that an injury to one is an injury to all, and that the only way to move forward and do so with dignity and strength is if you do it as a unified group. And so he's like, we have to band together and stand firm against the way that the employer treats us. And it was a dangerous thing to be talking about because it ends up leading to what they call the Great Maritime Strike of 1934. And to show you just like how insane this is, I have footage from the Maritime Strike of 1934 because after the union got together and they're like, we want improvement across the board on these things, X, Y, and Z, right? And the employers are like, absolutely not. You can just suck it. They then got to this conflict where the dock workers, the longshoremen, were like, well, we are going on strike. We're not going to work. And now you're going to have all this product sitting on your ships, not going anywhere. And no money for sure has to be worse than less money. And it mobilizes the city of San Francisco so rapidly. The mayor at the time not only brings out the police force mounted with like military equipment, but mobilizes the National Guard to come in and break up this strike. So here's a little sample of it so that you can see what's going on there in 1934. That's actual archival footage from San Francisco in 1934. And there's some really just intense recordings of the mayor at the time talking about how anyone who stands with the labor union is a threat to national security, and that by unionizing, they need to be brought down. And so there's this militarization of the police force, and they are effectively armed and just sent out onto the streets to break up this labor union. But it doesn't work. What ends up happening is more and more of these longshoremen band together, and under the rhetoric and leadership of Harry Bridges, they find this unwavering, unbroken unity as a whole. And so they start to unite on an even bigger level. And so during this strike of 1934, it culminates, it hits its like crescendo, I think, on July 5th with Bloody Thursday. And what happens is the police raid the waterfront, and they go down there and just start breaking up people, firing shots out there, shooting gas canisters, riding horses through the street and beating people with these like clubs, essentially. And 2 men end up getting shot. And it was a coordinated raid on the Union Mess Hall at the corner of Stewart and Mission down in San Francisco. And Howard Sperry was a striking sailor, and Nick Counterask was a member of the Cooks Union and a strike sympathizer helping out. And both these men end up getting shot and killed in the back. And then hundreds of other people are wounded during this strike as well. And when they end up getting killed, there's this massive funeral. I think it was something like just north of 40,000 longshoremen show up for the funeral the next day, and it becomes a sticking point. It is mobilizing in a way that people hadn't seen before for everyone out there. And Bloody Thursday becomes the rallying cry for people saying that enough is enough, that not only are they taking away our wages and our jobs and our security, but now they're at a point where they can actually kill us. And it has a tremendous effect to the opposite degree that the police and the city government was hoping for. And so, in fact, you start to see 2 really extreme points. One is that on July 9th, the strike claims a second victim. This was up in Seattle. So this picture is from the strike down in San Francisco, but actually up in Seattle, there was another victim. And it was a police officer this time. The strikers rolled over one of the patrol vehicles that was out there, and a deputy ends up shooting himself. Hold on a second there. I think I lost you guys for a second. I'm back. So this guy, he ends up getting shot in his own police vehicle at that time. And so it just accelerates things to a complete degree beyond what anyone was expecting. Let me see if I could get my screen back for you guys here. We had a momentary blackout there. Here we go. Let me know if you guys can see that. Hopefully you can. So not only does this become a huge thing in San Francisco, but the maritime right of the 1930s goes all the way up the coast. And so we're seeing it happen in, Los Angeles, Seattle, and even Tacoma. And I'm trying to think if I've got the pictures here for you guys. The strike was going on in Tacoma at the same time. Where are we here? Yeah, so there was a huge, they're called a mob in the newspaper, but they were longshoremen strikers up in Seattle as well. And then in Tacoma, it was simultaneous that both the longshoremen trying to unionize as well as the lumber workers of the 1930s were both on strike at this time. And the same thing happens in Tacoma, where the National Guard is deployed out in Tacoma and given the opportunity to use both tear gas and lethal force. And so you can see these guys out here taking any measure necessary to try and break this strike. But like I said, it's having the opposite effect, where people are at the point of desperation, so much so now that they're like, absolutely not. You're not going to compel us back into work with violence. And Harry Bridges keeps arriving as an arbitrator and an advocate. And one of the really incredible things about him is kind of twofold for me. Number one is that he is, as a person, incredibly charming and articulate, and so has the ability to very clearly put out what the union is looking for in no uncertain terms. The other thing that's really great about him is that for his entire career, really his entire life, he is on the side of the people. So whatever the rank and file union wanted is what he did. He was never out there advancing personal interests or taking anything to the table. What the people wanted is what he brought into the arbitration and negotiations. And if you look at the testimony from this guy, and we'll get to see a little bit of it here in a second, he's so remarkably honest. At no point does he say something that's that you would expect someone to say, right? Like, he never tries to dance around a point. He just answers stuff honestly and empathetically, and it makes a very clear case for why people should just be treated better. And during these maritime strikes in the 1930s, the things that the labor union was really advocating for was for an increase in wages, a decrease in the working hours throughout the week, and most importantly, a hiring hall. And the hiring hall was the holy grail of this whole thing, because it effectively allowed the union to be in control of who went out and worked. So even though the employer would continue to work or to pay for this hiring hall, it would be under union control. And you would go in, and if you were a member of the union, you would go in and you'd be like, I want to work. And the hiring hall would set it up so that everybody, in theory, would work the same amount of hours in a year. So if you hit your level of hours, then they would start giving work to the next guy. And so to try and make it equitable, they would keep it so that everybody in the union would have equal amount of work and everyone would be on standardized pay. And so that you could bring home the same amount of money as anybody else and be guaranteed the same amount of hours as anybody else within the union. And this was really the thing that people wanted more than anything. And they got it. after the intense violence of the maritime strike of 1934, which again was all up and down the coast, they reached a point where they were like, okay, the employers caved, and they were like, we will do this. And it changed everything, really. Let's see if I've got some good shots for you guys here. So Harry Bridges, first and foremost, emerges as not just a leader, but really a hero at the time for bringing the Union together. And like I said, one of the things about him that people adored was his honesty, right? So at one point, the employers were like, we'll just cut this guy out and we'll break them apart from the inside. And so they went to Harry Bridges and they're like, here's $100,000. You take it, you sail home to Australia, and we could be done with this right now. And he's like, no. And then he went to his union and he was like, hey, these guys just offered me $100,000. If you want, I will take it. I'll leave and you guys can handle this. And they're like, no, absolutely not. And he's like, okay, because if you want, we'll take the $100,000. I'll give it to each of you guys. You could disperse it amongst yourselves. Just use it however you want. And then we could be done with this. And they're like, no, we want something for the future. And so Harry goes back out to bat for these guys. And like I said, they eventually get to the point where they now have a strong union. And so Harry becomes the president of the International Longshore and Warehouse Union, or the ILWU, which anytime you talk about Harry Bridges, the ILWU is the most common term you're going to see throughout the whole thing here, right? And one of the strengths and I suppose eventual weaknesses of the ILWU is that it's very closely aligned with the Communist Party, because there are multiple people in the ILWU who are communists, who are fighting for sort of that lifestyle, as well as there's a tremendous amount of socialists. And really, there's such a melting pot of people within there that it has a whole variety inside. And that's the thing that becomes kind of a problem for it, because the first thing that the US government does to try and discredit this whole thing is they're like, well, you're communists. And the ILWU as a whole could be like, well, that's not true. There's people from 1,000 different walks here, and there's no like majority, so we're not all communists. But they really start to focus in later on Harry, and that's where some of the trouble comes in. I want to share with you guys a clip here, because Harry gets himself into trouble the first time, because not only is he fighting for labor rights, but he's really a strong political activist as well. And in Harry's mind, the two line up. So let me give you his own words first, and then I'll break this down for you guys as to what's happening here. But this is while he's talking to the Senate.
Swing trade union, and that's the way those people think. And as long as my rank and file feel that way, my job is to represent them that way.
What do you mean by a left-wing trade union?
Well, obviously, on the record, it's a union that means that's willing to arbitrate. To start with. That's a matter of record. It's also a union that believes in a lot of rank-and-file democracy and control. It's a union, I'm giving you my definitions now, of a left-wing union. It's a union that believes that its officers should be easy to remove and should function under a setup where their wages and expenses are no more than the highest paid at the most. The highest paid worker that's a member of the union. It's also a union that recognizes that from time to time it's got to stand up and fight for certain things that mightn't necessarily only be wages, hours, and conditions. Civil liberties, racial equality, and things like that.
So this is why it's crazy. Harry Bridges is being accused of being a communist, and because he's working with people in the labor union who identify as communists, and the communists and the socialists within this labor union are being like, hey, here's things that we should have. Equal pay. We should have a say and what happens in our lives. We need to see civil liberties. And one of the big things that Harry Bridges was a personal champion for was that there needed to be racial equality. And he was a proponent of this from the very first moment, because there were a vast diversity of racial groups within the Union. And you couldn't have, racial inequality creating schisms within that group, because it was about creating unity, that everyone had to be equal so that you could stay strong and together. And so he's like, it doesn't matter, what your race is. We all need to be given an exact equal amount in this. And that's how we'll remain strong enough to stand up to big businesses, essentially. And so when he goes to these Senate committees and they're like, do you believe these communist ideas? And a lot of people will be like, well, no. He's like, yes, absolutely. And they're like, are you a communist? And he's like, no. And they're like, so what's the deal here? And he's like, listen, these are the things we want. All right. That's all there is to it. Stop being weird about it. And so it was so revolutionary. And it's the reason that people started to just love him without any question. The Union was behind him 100%, because for the racial equality, this was, and you could watch interviews, a lot of these guys who were Black longshoremen were like, this is the first time anybody had been talking like this in the group. And it was amazing. And for the rest of the Union, it was like, you knew that Harry meant what he said, because there was no discrepancy between what was said in a Senate committee and what he said in the hiring hall. He was exactly who he was at all times, and was constantly advocating for these groups. And so you see the ripple effect all the way throughout. So like I said, in the 1930s, this is a shot from Pier 41 in Seattle in 1934 during the maritime strike that was happening up here. You can see that the police in Seattle were armed with submachine guns. Here in Tacoma, the mayor was, if you see on the left side of this article here, the lumber workers were being called terrorists at the time. And there was a movement to enact martial law throughout the city of Tacoma. And all of this violence and vitriol was happening against laborers at the time. And eventually, as they finally earned the right to have things like the hiring hall here, it changed everything, right? So from within a month, you see this switch from these guys, these longshoremen who were called wharf rats at the time, right? Just seen as the lowest part of society, just cogs to be discarded. Like if they were injured or killed on a job, it literally didn't matter at all. You didn't have to worry about it. To now, they were being called the lords of the docks. And they had power and influence in their own lives. And it reflected outwards pretty dramatically, because they were now responsible for the lifeblood of this area, right? So the success and the prestige of cities like San Francisco or Tacoma or Seattle is the fact that they are port towns and that they control the import-export of goods. And that's universally great, not only because you see a tremendous amount of business come into the city, but it determines where that business goes outwards. And there's a tremendous amount of revenue to be made from customs, right? Like you want to be a port town and you really want to be a successful port town. But when the people that run the actual loading and unloading of the ships have influence in that, you now have to consider them as people, right? And actually give them a space at the table and create something. So there's this dramatic revolutionary moment where America becomes a little more democratic, because now these people have a voice. Thanks, Harry Bridges. It starts to create conflict again, because now the dock workers actually are allowed to have conversations, right, about what is important in the world. They start to exert that pressure. And you see it in the late 1930s when dock workers under the leadership of Harry Bridges stopped shipping scrap steel to Japan. And this is at the beginning of World War II, but not yet at the point where the United States has entered into World War II. And even from Tacoma, a tremendous amount of materials like lead and copper were being sold overseas to the Japanese and the Germans. And in San Francisco, Harry Bridges and his people were like, no, we're not going to do that because we're going to see this material be used against us. This is going to come back as a detriment to the United States. And sure enough, through the looking glass of time, right, we know that they were right. But nobody in the government at that time liked that there was this political influence being exerted by dock workers, right? And so there really starts to be a bigger push to put Harry Bridges out of the game. The first thing that they thought that they could do is just deport him because he was still Australian at this point. And so they tried to look for a way to get rid of him, but everything was in order. So again, they put him on trial as an agitator and a communist. And this first trial, I'm trying to remember the year that it happens. I think it was in 1938, somewhere in there, about 1938. Harry goes on trial and it backfires so spectacularly. Not only do they not find any credible witnesses to come out against Harry, but they can't find any concrete evidence to prove that he is a member of the Communist Party, because he's not. Just because he works with them because they're members of the union doesn't mean that he himself is a communist. And so in a last-ditch effort, the prosecution actually puts Harry on the stand and grills him with questions. And that is their true undoing, because as soon as Harry starts talking, the defense, the prosecution, and most importantly, the judge are like, shoot, we got nothing here whatsoever. Because again, he's so candid. He's straightforward and he's passionate about the cause that he believes in. And so instead of taking a cautious approach to his own defense, he just lays it out there. He's like, these are the things I believe. This is why. And the judge at the time actually ends up just engaging with Harry in these long, like philosophical discussions, kind of about the course of humanity and where they should be going. And pretty much early on, the prosecution was like, all right, we screwed this up. So Harry walks, found not guilty on all charges. And again, it's another galvanizing moment where Harry emerges from this trial now as a hero of the people. He's the everyman who can go in. And so there's an increase of people joining the unions. You see a reemergence of the hiring halls. Up here in Tacoma, people had returned to work at this point and now had collective bargaining. They had strong unions. And I actually think it's worth noting that in Tacoma, we were the only one where the hiring hall was exclusively under union control. Normally, the hiring hall was run by the union, but paid for and kind of owned by the employer. And that wasn't the case in Tacoma exclusively. This was an entirely union-run experience down here. There starts to be this like hero culture that arrives around Harry Bridges, and everyone really comes out to bat for this guy. He ends up on the cover of Time magazine, and everyone's like sees him now as the face of the labor movement. And so he takes this moment to really continue that narrative and to push for more rights. So you see the union now not only being able to exert its power on like political decisions, like where scrap is sent to during wartime, but also in maintaining a work-life balance for themselves, down to a 40-hour work week, a higher living wage, maintaining a hiring hall, and like all these things that we now have as just a general labor force throughout the United States that we really take for granted. You see them emerge for the first time ever during these labor movements and violent strikes of the 1930s. And Harry Bridges was the prominent figure of that happening at the time. What's really cool for me is that you see it span beyond just the western coast here. There was a tremendous amount of desire for labor equality in Hawaii. So in Hawaii, they had something called the Big Five, which was essentially this remnant of missionaries that had come to Hawaii. And I'm trying to remember what the quote was, something like they came to do good and they ended up doing real well for themselves. Because effectively, these missionaries end up buying a ton of land, creating sugar plantations, and then just turning a bunch of profit through slave-like conditions of Hawaiian labor at the time. And the success of the Big Five in Hawaii was that they could pit people against one another, right? So if you have these sugar plantations with a tremendous amount of immigrant populations coming in, there were, Japanese, Korean, Filipino, Chinese, and Native Hawaiians all working on the sugar plantations, right? And they're separate. They're segregated by language and culture. And so the Big Five, these employers, are pitting different ethnic groups against one another. If like the Japanese labor force decided that they wanted to go on strike or demand higher wages, then they'd be like, oh, well, the Chinese are going to do it for 3 cents less. And so by pitting these racial groups against one another and just forcing them to compete for whatever they could get, they create a culture on Hawaii where everyone is not only struggling to survive, but in competition with one another to do it. And it creates just untold problems. On top of the fact that Hawaii is already in contention because it's a U.S. territory. After the United States government, big business comes in and overthrows the Hawaiian monarchy in the 1800s. They take over this area, but don't turn it into a state, right? So you now have this unregulated, unpoliced area where business really becomes its own monarchy on the island of Hawaii. And it makes it incredibly difficult for anyone to do anything. And nobody is unified because the different groups are essentially at war with one another. And I want to take a special moment to shout out just how insane and difficult this was, right? So like the longshore work was incredibly hazardous and difficult, especially for what it was. And in Hawaii, look at this. These are outfits that the sugarcane workforce had to put on. And you were out there working in this intense heat, right? Dressed like this because this is armor. Specifically, the women members of the labor force out there harvesting sugarcane would dress like this to prevent the most dreaded member of the Hawaiian Isles, the centipede, from coming out and attacking them. This is a centipede. For scale, it's about the size of my hand. And these would just roam around out on the sugar plantation, and they could get into your shoes or your pants or whatever, and they bite. And fortunately, they're a non-lethal bite. But after this, I'm going to share a link to it, or you can Google it. There's this guy who, for science purposes, let's say, lets himself get bit by a centipede on camera to demonstrate how much it sucks. Thanks. We already knew. But it's excruciating. It's an absolutely painful and devastating bite. And so you're out there with essentially slavers, these big business guys running around on horses, making sure that you're working for next to nothing in the heat, being attacked by centipedes. It's terrible. And so when Harry Bridges, who you can see right here holding the sign that says Congress should investigate Big Five monopoly, comes out here, he really starts to help the people of Hawaii come together. And they got to see how successful the maritime strike of the 1930s was, and how these different racially segregated groups came together in this instant to fight for a competitive wage and a living lifestyle. And so here's Harry talking about this in Hawaii.
I'm not afraid of the union's ability to defend itself. But you say, how are they trying to break the union? They'd be in there proposing a wage cut, as they proposed in sugar and pineapple, if the union wasn't strong enough and able to battle. As a matter of fact, last year in the sugar industry, they locked the union out to cut wages.
By law, we compel them to recognize the Union. We're back of you, but that doesn't have anything to do with this present dispute. I'm asking how at this present dispute is any evidence of any intention to break the Union.
Gosh, if you wait, listen, Senator, if you depend upon the law in Hawaii to get Union recognition, you'll wait a long, long time. I've been in the courts in Hawaii. The first battle we had to fight in Hawaii against these same employers, and these employers stood up in the courts, and they said it. It's on the record. They said the Constitution of the United States doesn't apply to Hawaii. That's the first fight we had to put up in Hawaii.
And there he nails it. This is from a newspaper article around the time where Massachusetts, of all places, is up in arms over the fact that people are talking about Hawaii gaining their statehood. And remember, it's occupied in 1893, and it doesn't achieve statehood until 1959. The islands of Hawaii were not a state in the Union until 1959. And during this period of just tumultuous political intrigue, the labor force of Hawaii was just up for grabs because people were saying, hey, you guys aren't protected by the Constitution. We could do whatever we want here. And Harry comes out, where is my picture of him, and is like, absolutely not. We need to fight this. And so under his guidance and with a lot of his leadership, the various groups of Hawaii band together, and each of these different groups stands united and says, all right, that's enough. And so now that you can't pit the different racial groups against one another, they finally make gains and finally getting some collective bargaining. And now there's a union out on Hawaii. And oh boy, did people freak out on both sides. The rank and file, the workers of the United States are now in love with this guy because he's coming out and he's unifying the people and creating living wages and security and hiring halls and making life better across the board, preserving these jobs and getting people back out there. And the US government and big business cannot handle it. So in 1941, comes the second trial for Mr. Harry Bridges. And this time they're pushing real hard to deport him. And again, under communist charges. And eventually, because the first trial was unsuccessful, and in fact, the judge basically falls in love with this guy, they bring in a sympathetic judge. They hire essentially all of these witnesses. There's so much evidence pointing to the fact that like debarred lawyers, racketeers, people that they're just dredging up to act as witnesses to be like, oh yeah, he's a commie, show up and they're like, all right, Harry, you're guilty for sure. Everyone here that we've paid for agrees on it. And so the rallying call goes out that he needs to be either imprisoned or deported back to Australia. And he appeals it to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court throws it out. They get to the point where they're like, I can't believe this is still happening. Please stop talking about it. Harry Bridges is staying here. You guys just need to deal with it. And so eventually in 1945, Harry Bridges gets his citizenship. And this is a monumentous day for him. Here's a clip.
In San Francisco, Harry Bridges is ordered to jail as a threat to the national security. The Longshoremen's Union president had been out on $25,000 bail since last April, when he was convicted of perjury for denying membership in the Communist Party. In the U.S. District Courtroom, the government, led by Special Prosecutor F. Joseph Donahue, charges that Bridges' activities since the outbreak of the Korean War have constituted giving aid and comfort to the enemy. Bridges denies the charges, but his bail is revoked. The Australian-born leftist faces possible deportation if he loses his appeal from the perjury conviction. Until then, the government is keeping in very close touch with Mr. Bridges.
So there's so many things about this that I'd like to bring up. First of all, it was a perjury trial, right? So the thing that they have to stick to is like, yes, he lied about being a communist, and that's what we're going to send him to jail or Australia for, right? And again, they have this whole like circus court, and then eventually the Supreme Court throws it out and it's done. But you see a tremendous change, I think, in the way that Harry Bridges lives his life from here on out, because there's a level of paranoia that gets talked about from here on out, where understandably so, he gets just a little constantly feeling like he's being watched. And frankly, he is. The FBI under the leadership of Hoover really was intense about Harry Bridges' life and saw him as an agitator and threat to national security, and were trying to do anything to get rid of him. And a story that I think is absolutely fascinating is that people that knew Harry at this time, especially during the trial, would say that he would type things out on a typewriter, like love poems or just nonsense or like crude stuff. And then he would tear up the piece of paper and he would take out the tape from the typewriter and tear that into tiny little pieces and put it in an ashtray. And then if he went out of the room or something, he'd come back and those things would be gone because the FBI was collecting it. And he thought it was so funny because he just envisioned someone in a room somewhere spending all their time taping those little things back together just to be like, there once was a girl from Nantucket. And so he managed to keep a sense of humor about this whole thing during the whole time. But I know, just looking at accounts of people that knew him and seeing sort of his general life trend, that it changed him to really have sort of a distrust for the level of government around him. And really you see a propulsion of his stance on civil rights, really, in a lot of ways. And I think one of the most shining examples of that is that after the end of World War II, the labor force is coming back, and there's really a big push to maintain people in this workforce. He wants to keep people in the union and make sure that they're still getting taken care of. And right as the U.S. starts to enter the Korean War, he comes out as an active proponent against the Korean War. And even his own union at the time is like, whoa, we are not with that at all. And so the union is like, maybe tone it down a little bit. I think you're getting a little too crazy. And so the government comes after him hard in that moment. And they're like, aha, there it is. He's anti-American. Let's get rid of him. And the union was still so pro Harry Bridges that they're like, you need to sit back down, guys. Don't even talk about getting rid of Harry. Sure, his views can be a little progressive sometimes, but he's our guy. Get rid of him. And so he goes on trial yet again. And what I think is fascinating about this final trial, right? I think it's 4 times that he ends up going on trial. The final one, where they really just try and throw anything that they can at this guy to get rid of him, who is now, after 1945, an American citizen. He gets his papers. Is that even the employers come out and are on the defense of Harry Bridges. And from what I read about that, one of the big things with these employers was, even though they've been mortal enemies with Harry Bridges from the start, they knew him and they knew that he was honest and that he had these rules, essentially, that he had a code. And so they're like, better this guy than to bring somebody else in on this whole thing and really disrupt our entire lives. On a personal note, Harry Bridges had by this point been married twice, and his second wife, they end up getting divorced because she effectively says, he's not married to me, he's married to the union. And so his third and final marriage is kind of a testament, I think, to the mentality and the heart of Harry Bridges, because he meets this young woman right here, Noriko Sawada, in San Francisco, where she was introduced by her employer, a guy named Mr. Gary, who was a civil rights lawyer. And they were attending a fundraiser for mine, mill, and smelter workers, right? So they're both already active in this pro-labor union world. And in 1958, they decide to get married. And here's the hook on this. First of all, Noriko, or Nikki, was Nisa. So she was part of that Japanese American community where they were interned in these camps during World War II. So she already has a very personal and passionate view about civil rights in the United States. Harry Bridges is obviously very much in this same camp. And they find this connection together. And in 1958, when they try and go and get married in Reno, Nevada, the county courthouse clerk refuses them a marriage license because Nikki was ethnic Japanese. And in Nevada, there was an 1846 statute banning the marriage between any white person and, quote, any person of Ethiopian, Black, Malay, Brown, Mongolian, Yellow, or American Indian race, end quote. And so they lose it. They go to the federal district court and get the marriage license to be issued. And then a guy, Judge Taylor Wines, grants the order to the couple. And this prompts 1 year later, the Nevada legislature to repeal the state's stance on anti-interracial marriage. So these two, power couple, right? Not only are they out there fighting for labor rights and human rights throughout the United States, but they are on their personal level fighting to create a better, more integrated, more progressive United States. Like, it's just nonstop with these two. And so I think it's not only are they a match made in heaven, but you really see a success in them working together towards their goals. And both of them are remarkably effective orators and just public figures. And so Nikki, within her own right, is a tremendous civil rights activist. Outside of just, her work with Harry Bridges, she ends up being a very well-respected civil rights activist throughout her entire life until she passes in 2003 and is commemorated for her work throughout those years. And so Harry, right, this is where we start to see the narrative with him change. And it happens in the 1960s. And Harry is still the president of the ILWU. And in the 1960s, there's a modernization of the dockfront workforce, right? And this is seen in the very literal Mechanization and Modernization Agreement of 1961, which effectively, long story short, allows the employers, these docks, to bring in cranes, machines to start making this work easier. And it's met with sort of a mixed emotion because it kind of means less jobs, right? Like if a machine can do it, there's less longshoremen involved in this. And there's a sense of pride in the way that they do their work, right? But the flip side of this is it makes the work easier and it's significantly less hard on their bodies and they see a better quality of life. And so the Mechanization and Modernization Act of 1961, Harry Bridges goes in as an arbitrator and negotiator for this whole thing. And if they come to this agreement where, you can start bringing machines down into the dock front and there will be an increase in wages for union members. They are going to be given earlier retirement and there's going to be more job security. The unfortunate side of this ends up being that there's this B class of workers, or essentially union members who haven't been in for as long, and they get kind of sidelined by this whole thing, where now there's not enough jobs for everyone around. And instead of just promoting kind of equally throughout the pool, as was the tradition with the hiring hall from the very beginning, now you start to see these guys who aren't in the union for as long getting sidelined from a lot of this work. And so in the 1970s, there is a call for another strike, that something has to be done about this. And it's a messy thing because the people that are now here calling for the strike they know Harry Bridges, right? He's still the president and he's seen differently by an entire generation. There's this whole group of people that knew him as the guy who advocated for their ability to have the rights that they have right now at all. But then there's a whole new generation that kind of sees Harry Bridges as the guy preventing them from taking another stance. And they blame him in a lot of ways for negotiating this agreement that machines could be brought down and that they are getting sidelined for it. And there's this clip of Harry getting ready for this 1970s strike, which I think really kind of encapsulates the situation beautifully.
Automation.
They call it wireless.
The government, as they have in the past, will go to court and they'll ask the judge for an order. It's an injunction saying they're on strike and they can't continue to strike. That's the way it would seem to me. Then it's up to the court to get the people to obey that injunction. I hope the court doesn't depend on me, because I don't think I'd be able to do it. See? Because those workers, those ships are not going to sail unless those men decide they want to let them sail. Now, it's that simple. See?
So many things to take away from that brief clip. Number one, Harry Bridges is not the young man that he used to be. And when he walks up to that podium and is like, wireless microphones, I don't even get it. And one of the guys in the audience is like, that wireless, Harry. And like, you see this paragon of labor virtue up here, having some difficulty navigating the new waters, as he has just aged to a point where he's not the young man that he once was, but he is there. You know, he was against the strike in the 1970s, but the union wanted it. And so he is there. And he's saying the exact same things that he always was, that they were stronger together, that what the union wants and needs has to be addressed by the employer, and that whatever they need to do to bring that voice to the table, they're going to do. And that if they don't want the ships to move, those ships aren't going to move. Effectively, at the end of this whole thing, the strike of the 1970s wasn't as instrumental or motivational, or really, they didn't get everything they wanted. But after a long strike, there was eventually a negotiation and things turned out. But it also spells sort of the end of Harry Bridges' time. And in 1977, he retires after a very long, pretty much uncontested run as the president of the ILWU, and new leadership and new generations take over. And today there's, it is still one of, if not the most progressive union out there. The ILWU is still out there. I think it's Local 23 that's here in Tacoma, and they're still active and have maintained the fire, passion, direction, and legacy that was established in the 1930s of just trying to make sure that people are taken care of, and that the way you do it is you get together and you stay strong, because an injury to one is an injury to all. And it has transformed the way that we operate as a nation. It's something that generations that have come after just take for granted and don't realize that there was this moment where people had to literally die in the street for a 40-hour work week and an ability to have some security in doing your job one day after another. So when you hear the name Harry Bridges, know that long ago, an adventurous seafaring Aussie took these ideas of treating people better and treating them fairly, and arrived here on the coast of the United States, and then fought as a figurehead for the people of the United States for generations. And it's a really incredible thing. To see or hear more about this, there is, fittingly enough, an incredible display down at the Foss Waterway Seaport Museum, which has just opened, which will have a bust of Harry Bridges down there, as well as a really cool setup talking about the labor unions and the way that labor has changed not only the fabric of the nation, but the way that we interact with each other on a daily basis. So go on down to the Foss Seaport, and remember, every third Thursday is free admission. So go get a taste for it and then get your membership. What's holding you back? If you guys have questions, let me know. But honestly, thank you guys so much for coming out for this one, because I think it's a really great topic. And don't worry, if you missed the live stream, it stays online forever, because we, like the union, our equal opportunity. So thank you guys. If you have questions, let me know. If not, I really just appreciate you coming out, and I will see you very soon. We've got a ton of cool content coming up. But until then, get out there, keep on exploring.